the British Foreign Minister, or Foreign Secretary David Cameron, announcing that 3 companies that operate in the UK will now face British sanctions because they're helping to finance the war in Sudan. Musa Mdunge is a political analyst based at the University of Dundee in the UK. Musa, good afternoon to you. So in a way, I think most of the West and Europe have almost ignored the conflict in Sudan. Is this a reminder to that part of the world about how serious this conflict in our continent actually is?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and to your viewers. Yes, indeed. I think this is a clear reminder to the West that conflicts other than the Russian war in Ukraine, including the Israeli-Hamas conflict, are currently ongoing around the world. And Sudan is one of those flag points that shows up, particularly because of its humanitarian impact. We know that about 6.6 million Sudanese people have been displaced in a region that is facing other conflicts, such as the one that is ongoing in South Sudan. We know that Ethiopia has had its own challenges internally. And currently, this particular conflict, given where the country is situated, around that key Nile basin, which is a key economic location, particularly when we think about countries like Egypt that depend on the Nile for their sustenance. So there are huge economic, there are huge geopolitical implications to this conflict, and the decision as taken by the United Kingdom shows how important this issue is turning out to be, as UK plus Europe at large are faced with the challenge of huge levels of refugee and migration flows flowing out of Africa and the Middle East. And this is something that they need to be seized with.
I mean, it also shows you how money works. Money is international. You have a conflict in Sudan. That money is flowing in and out of Sudan to other countries. If you want to end the conflict, you also need to stop the money flows. I mean, I hate to say it, but in conflicts like this, they're often about resources.
Certainly, right. It's often about resources, and this is the double edge about the role of money and financial resources in times of conflict, because on the one hand, we see the importance in mitigating flows of such resources to armed forces. But on the other hand is the issue around the humanitarian impact and the economic impact of conflict. And what would it mean to then ensure that such resources don't find themselves in the hands of the people who perhaps most need to find these resources? And so interesting to see that part of the decisions undertaken by the United Kingdom is to ensure that this particular measure exempts any financial flows for the purpose of humanitarian aid. And that's very key, because they've made a commitment of £89 million towards an aid package that would support UNICEF in terms of its emergency and life-saving food assistance and support that it's giving to the people. And this is key because this particular program is key to ensure issues around nutrition, water, hygiene for about 500,000 children under 5 is protected. This is what is at jeopardy here. So again, there is this double-edged sword towards this thing, and Western countries and other partners are trying to find solutions towards ensuring that they're able to provide enough support to ensure that you deal with the flows of people that are migrating to the other countries, facing pressure on countries such as Chad, Egypt, South Sudan, Ethiopia. But at the same time, also remember that we've got to deal with this conflict, because another economic challenge that it poses is around the Suez Canal. Remember that Port Sudan occupies a key strategic role, a very close port neighbor borderline with even Saudi Arabia. So a very key location that this country is at. And so for the leaders around the world, it is key to find a solution to this conflict, given the economic calculus, but also more importantly here, Stephen, given that humanitarian calculus that everybody has got to consider.
The situation in Sudan, it's really between 2 groups of people. Some people suggest it's really between 2 generals. That may be a bit simplistic. Would it receive a lot more attention from much of the rest of the world if it wasn't for the Middle East and Ukraine? And particularly Ukraine seemed to suck up almost all the space there was for Western news outlets for a very long time until Gaza started.
Indeed, this conflict has somewhat, always received under par representation, especially when we think of Western media. And, one can make that argument, Stephen, that if it weren't for, the Israel-Hamas conflict currently ongoing, the Russia-Ukraine conflict currently ongoing, that, more spotlight would be placed on this particular conflict. But it is sad to say, Stephen, that when we look to history points out that that is not in case, or could never have been in case the fact, because when we look at the Middle East, it's always really been a hot button issue and a problem for Western leaders, and has always represented challenges, whether we think around issues around sectarianism, terrorism, and also national challenges. If we think around issues like the Arab Spring, for example. So unfortunately, the thing that we need to be asking is, what are African leaders doing and African institutions doing to shed a spotlight on this particular conflict and to elevate the importance of this conflict in terms of the international agenda of peace, particularly in the United Nations? And this is where we see the importance of countries like South Africa, countries like Egypt, these middle power countries that are able to exercise influence not only within their regions, but exercise middle power diplomacy between the global north and the global south. And this is the kind of interventions that we need to see in order to ensure that Sudan and its people get a fair representation in the global agenda. That is what is needed currently.
Musa Mdunge, thank you, political analyst based at the University of Dundee in the UK. Really appreciate the time.